Chapter 10 Carcomac the Bowman. As Carthoris moved through the forest toward the distant cliffs with Thuvia's hand still tight pressed in his, he wondered a little at the girl's continued silence. Yet the contact of her cool palm against his was so pleasant that he feared to break the spell of her newfound reliance in him by speaking. Onward through the dim wood they passed until the shadows of the quick-coming Martian night commenced to close down upon them. Then it was that Carthoris turned to speak to the girl at his side. They must plan together for the future. It was his idea to pass through the cliffs at once, if they could locate the passage, and he was quite positive that they were now close to it, but he wanted her assent to the proposition. As his eyes rested upon her, he was struck by her strangely ethereal appearance. She seemed suddenly to have dissolved into the tenuous substance of a dream, and as he continued to gaze upon her, she faded slowly from his sight. For an instant he was dumbfounded, and then the whole truth flashed suddenly upon him. Jav had caused him to believe that Thuvia was accompanying him through the wood while, as a matter of fact, he had detained the girl for himself. Carthoris was horrified. He cursed himself for his stupidity, and yet he knew that the fiendish power which the Letharian had invoked to confuse him may have deceived any. Scarce had he realized the truth than he had started to retrace his steps toward Lothar, but now he moved at a trot, the earthly thews that he had inherited from his father carrying him swiftly over the soft carpet of fallen leaves and rank grass. Thuria's brilliant light flooded the plain before the walled city of Lothar as Carthoris broke from the wood opposite the great gate that had given the fugitives egress from the city earlier in the day. At first he saw no indication that there was another than himself anywhere about. The plain was deserted. No myriad bowmen camped now beneath the overhanging verdure of the giant trees. No gory heaps of tortured dead defaced the beauty of the scarlet sward. All was silence. All was peace. The Heliumite, scarce pausing at the forest's verge, pushed on across the plain toward the city, when soon he descried a huddled form in the grass at his feet. It was the body of a man, lying prone. Carthoris turned the figure over upon its back. It was Jaff, but torn and mangled almost beyond recognition. The prince bent low to note if any spark of life remained, and as he did so the lids raised and dull, suffering eyes looked up into his. "The Princess of Tarth," cried Carthoris. "Where is she? Answer me, man, or I complete the work that another has so well begun." "Komal," muttered Jaff. "He sprang upon me, and would have devoured me but for the girl." Then they went away together into the wood, the girl and the great Banth, her fingers twined in his tawny mane. "Which way went they?" asked Carthoris. "There," replied Jaff faintly, "toward the passage through the cliffs." The Prince of Helium waited to hear no more, but springing to his feet, raced back again into the forest. It was dawn when he reached the mouth of the dark tunnel that would lead him to the other world beyond this valley of ghostly memories and strange hypnotic influences and menaces. Within the long, dark passages he met with no accident or obstacle, coming at last into the light of day beyond the mountains, and no great distance from the southern verge of the domains of the Torquesians, not more than 150 hod at the most. From the boundary of Torquas to the city of Anther is a distance of some 200 hods, so that the Heliumite had before him a journey of more than 150 earth miles between him and Anther. He could at best but hazard a chance guess that toward Anther Thuvia would take her flight. There lay the nearest water, and there may be expected some day a rescuing party from her father's empire, for Carthoris knew Thuvendin well enough to know that he would leave no stone unturned until he had tracked down the truth as to his daughter's abduction, and learned all that there may be to learn of her whereabouts. He realized, of course, that the trick which had laid suspicion upon him would greatly delay the discovery of the truth, but little did he guess to what vast proportions had the results of the villainy of a stock of Dusar already grown. Evening, as he emerged from the mouth of the passage to look across the foothills in the direction of Anther, a Tarth battle fleet was winging its majestic way slowly toward the twin cities of Helium, while from far distant Kaal raced another mighty armada to join forces with its ally. He did not know that in the face of the circumstantial evidence against him even his own people had commenced to entertain suspicions that he may have stolen the Tarthian princess. He did not know of the lengths to which the Ducerians had gone to disrupt the friendship and alliance which existed between the three great powers of the Eastern Hemisphere, Helium, Tarth and Chaol. How Ducerian emissaries had found employment in important posts in the foreign offices of the three great nations, and how, through these men, messages from one Jeddak to another were altered and garbled until the patience and pride of the three rulers and former friends could no longer endure the humiliations and insults contained in these falsified papers. Not any of this he knew. Nor did he know how evening to the last John Carter, warlord of Mars, had refused to permit the Jeddak of Helium to declare war against either Tarth or Chaol because of his implicit belief in his son, and that eventually all would be satisfactorily explained. And now two great fleets were moving upon Helium, while the Ducerian spies at the court of Tardos Mors saw to it that the twin cities remained in ignorance of their danger. War had been declared by Thuvia, but the messenger who had been dispatched with the proclamation had been a Ducerian who had seen to it that no word of warning reached the twin cities of the approach of a hostile fleet. For several days diplomatic relations had been severed between Helium and her two most powerful neighbors, and with the departure of the ministers had come a total cessation of wireless communication between the disputants, as is usual upon Barsoom. But of all this Carthoris was ignorant. All that interested him at present was the finding of Thuvia of Tarth. Her trail beside that of the huge Banth had been well marked to the tunnel, and was once more visible leading southward into the foothills. As he followed rapidly downward toward the Dead Sea bottom, where he knew he must lose the spur in the resilient ochre vegetation, he was suddenly surprised to see a naked man approaching him from the northeast. As the fellow drew closer, Carthoris halted to await his coming. He knew that the man was unarmed, and that he was apparently a Litharian, for his skin was white and his hair auburn. He approached the Heliumite without sign of fear, and, when quite close, called out the cheery Barsoomian Kaor of greeting. "Who are you?" asked Carthoris. "I am Car Comac, Odwar of the Bowmen," replied the other. "A strange thing has happened to me. For ages Tario has been bringing me into existence as he needed the services of the army of his mind. Of all the bowmen it has been Car Comac who has been oftenest materialized. For a long time Taro has been concentrating his mind upon my permanent materialization. It has been an obsession with him that someday this thing could be accomplished and the future of Lothar assured. He asserted that matter was non-existent except in the imagination of man, that all was mental, and so he believed that by persisting in his suggestion he could eventually make of me a permanent suggestion in the minds of all creatures. Yesterday he succeeded, but at such a time, it must have come all unknown to him, as it came to me without my knowledge, as, with my horde of yelling bowmen, I pursued the fleeing Torquasians back to their ochre plains. As darkness settled and the time came for us to fade once more into thin air, I suddenly found myself alone upon the edge of the great plain, which lies over there at the foot of the low hills. My men were gone back to the nothingness from which they had sprung, but I remained, naked and unarmed. At first I could not understand, but at last came a realization of what had occurred. Tario's long suggestions had at last prevailed, and Car Comac had become a reality in the world of men, but my harness and my weapons had faded away with my fellows, leaving me naked and unarmed in a hostile country far from Lothar. "You wish to return to Lothar?" asked Carthoris. "No," replied Car Comac quickly. "I have no love for Tario. Being a creature of his mind, I know him too well. He is cruel and tyrannical, a master I have no desire to serve. Now that he has succeeded in accomplishing my permanent materialization, he will be unbearable, and he will go on until he has filled Lothar with his creatures. I wonder if he has succeeded as well with the maid of Lothar." "I thought there were no women there," said Carthoris. "In a hidden apartment in the palace of Tario," replied Car Comac, "the Jeddak has maintained the suggestion of a beautiful girl, hoping that some day she would become permanent. I have seen her there. She is wonderful, but for her sake I hope that Tario succeeds not so well with her as he has with me. Now, Red Man, I have told you of myself. What of you? Carthoris liked the face and manner of the bowman. There had been no sign of doubt or fear in his expression as he had approached the heavily armed Heliumite, and he had spoken directly and to the point. So the Prince of Helium told the bowman of Lothar who he was and what adventure had brought him to this far country. Good, exclaimed the other, when he had done. Carcomac will accompany you. Together we shall find the Princess of Tarth, and with you Carcomac will return to the world of men, such a world as he knew in the long gone past when the ships of mighty Lothar plowed angry Throxus, and the roaring surf beat against the barrier of these parched and dreary hills. What mean you? Asked Carthoris. Had you really a former actual existence? Most assuredly, replied Carcomac. In my day I commanded the fleets of Lothar, mightiest of all the fleets that sailed the 5 salt seas. Wherever men lived upon Barsoom there was the name of Carcomac known and respected. Peaceful were the land races in those distant days. Only the seafarers were warriors. But now has the glory of the past faded, nor did I think until I met you that there remained upon Barsoom a single person of our own mold who lived, and loved and fought as did the ancient seafarers of my time. Ah, but it will seem good to see men once again, real men. Never had I much respect for the landsmen of my day. They remained in their walled cities wasting their time in play, depending for their protection entirely upon the sea race. And the poor creatures who remain, the Tarios and Javs of Lothar, are even worse than their ancient forebears. Carthoris was a trifle skeptical as to the wisdom of permitting the stranger to attach himself to him. There was always the chance that he was but the essence of some hypnotic treachery which Tario or Jav was attempting to exert upon the Heliumite, and yet, so sincere had been the manner and the words of the bowman, so much the fighting man did he seem, but Carthoris could not find it in his heart to doubt him. The outcome of the matter was that he gave the naked Obwar leave to accompany him, and together they set out upon the spur of Thuvia and Comel. Down to the ochre sea bottom the trail led. There it disappeared, as Carthoris had known that it would, but where it entered the plain its direction had been toward Anther, and so toward Anther the two turned their faces. It was a long and tedious journey fraught with many dangers. The bowman could not travel at the pace set by Carthoris, whose muscles carried him with great rapidity over the face of the small planet, the force of gravity of which exerts so much less retarding power than that of the earth. 50 miles a day is a fair average for a Barsoomian, but the son of John Carter may easily have covered 100 or more miles had he cared to desert his newfound comrade. All the way they were in constant danger of discovery by roving bands of Torquesians, and especially was this true before they reached the boundary of Torquoise. Good fortune was with them, however, and although they sighted 2 detachments of the savage green men, they were not themselves seen, and so they came, upon the morning of the 3rd day, within sight of the glistening domes of distant Anther. Throughout the journey Carthoris had ever strained his eyes ahead in search of Thuvia and the great Banth, but not till now had he seen aught to give him hope. This morning, far ahead, halfway between themselves and Anther, the men saw 2 tiny figures moving toward the city. For a moment they watched them intently. Then Carthoris, convinced, leaped forward at a rapid run, Carcomac following as swiftly as he could. The Heliumite shouted to attract the girl's attention, and soon he was rewarded by seeing her turn and stand looking toward him. At her side the great Banth stood with uppricked ears, watching the approaching man. Not yet could Thuvia of Tarth have recognized Carthoris, though that it was he she must have been convinced, for she waited there for him without sign of fear. Soon he saw her point toward the northwest, beyond him. Without slackening his pace, he turned his eyes in the direction she indicated. Racing silently over the thick vegetation, not half a mile behind, came a score of fierce green warriors, charging him upon their mighty thoats. To their right was Carcomac, naked and unarmed, yet running valiantly toward Carthoris and shouting warning as though he, too, had but just discovered the silent, menacing company that moved so swiftly forward with couched spears and ready long swords. Carthoris shouted to the Lothlarian, warning him back, for he knew that he could but uselessly sacrifice his life by placing himself, all unarmed, in the path of the cruel and relentless savages. But Carcomac never hesitated. With shouts of encouragement to his new friend, he hurried onward toward the Prince of Helium. The red man's heart leaped in response to this exhibition of courage and self-sacrifice. He regretted now that he had not thought to give Carcomac one of his swords, but it was too late to attempt it, for should he wait for the Lothlarian to overtake him or return to meet him, the Torquesians would reach Thuvia of Tarth before he could do so. Evening as it was, it would be nip and tuck as to who came first to her side. Again he turned his face in her direction, and now, from Anther Way, he saw a new force hastening toward them, two medium-sized war-craft. An evening at the distance they still were from him, he discerned the device of Dusar upon their bows. Now, truly, seemed little hope for Thuvia of Tarth, with savage warriors of the hordes of Torquas charging toward her from one direction, and no less implacable enemies, in the form of the creatures of Astok, Prince of Dusar, bearing down upon her from another, while only a Banth, a red warrior, and an unarmed bowman were near to defend her. Her plight was quite hopeless, and her cause already lost before ever it was contested. As Thuvia saw Carthoris approaching, she felt again that unaccountable sensation of entire relief from responsibility and fear that she had experienced upon a former occasion, nor could she account for it. While her mind still tried to convince her heart that the Prince of Helium had been instrumental in her abduction from her father's court, she only knew that she was glad when he was by her side, and that with him there all things seemed possible, even such impossible things as escape from her present predicament. Now had he stopped, panting, before her. A brave smile of encouragement lit his face. "Courage, my princess," he whispered. To the girl's memory flashed the occasion upon which he had used those same words, in the throne room of Tario of Lothar, as they had commenced to slip down the sinking marble floor toward an unknown fate. Then she had not chidden him for the use of that familiar salutation, nor did she chide him now, though she was promised to another. She wondered at herself, flushing at her own turpitude, for upon Barsoom it is a shameful thing for a woman to listen to those two words from another than her husband or her betrothed. Carthoris saw her flush of mortification, and in an instant regretted his words. There was but a moment before the green warriors would be upon them. "Forgive me," said the man in a low voice. "Let my great love be my excuse, that, and the belief that I have but a moment more of life." And with the words he turned to meet the foremost of the green warriors. The fellow was charging with couched spear, but Carthoris leaped to one side, and as the great thoat and its rider hurtled harmlessly past him, he swung his long sword in a mighty cut that clove the green carcass in twain. Chapter 11. Green Men and White Apes. A Torquesian sword smote a glancing blow across the forehead of Carthoris. He had a fleeting vision of soft arms about his neck, and warm lips close to his before he lost consciousness. How long he lay there senseless he could not guess, but when he opened his eyes again he was alone, except for the bodies of the dead green men and Dusarians, and the carcass of a great banth that lay half across his own. Thuvia was gone, nor was the body of Carcomac among the dead. Weak from loss of blood, Carthoris made his way slowly toward Anther, reaching its outskirts at dark. He wanted water more than any other thing, and so he kept on up a broad avenue toward the great central plaza, where he knew the precious fluid was to be found in a half-ruined building opposite the great palace of the ancient Jeddak, who once had ruled this mighty city. Disheartened and discouraged by the strange sequence of events that seemed foreordained to thwart his every attempt to serve the Princess of Tarth, he paid little or no attention to his surroundings, moving through the deserted city as though no great white apes lurked in the black shadows of the mystery-haunted piles that flanked the broad avenues and the great plaza. But if Carthoris was careless of his surroundings, not so other eyes that watched his entrance into the plaza. and followed his slow footsteps toward the marble pile that housed the tiny, half-choked spring whose water one may gain only by scratching a deep hole in the red sand that covered it. And as the Heliumite entered the small building, a dozen mighty, grotesque figures emerged from the doorway of the palace to speed noiselessly across the plaza toward him. For half an hour Carthoris remained in the building, digging for water, and gaining the few much-needed drops, which were the fruits of his labor. Then he rose and slowly left the structure. Scarce had he stepped beyond the threshold than 12 Torquesian warriors leaped upon him. No time then to draw longsword, but swift from his harness flew his long, slim dagger, and as he went down beneath them more than a single green heart ceased beating at the bite of that keen point. Then they overpowered him and took his weapons away, but only 9 of the 12 warriors who had crossed the plaza returned with their prize. They dragged their prisoner roughly to the palace pits, where in utter darkness they chained him with rusty links to the solid masonry of the wall. "Tomorrow Tharban will speak with you," they said. "Now he sleeps, but great will be his pleasure when he learns who has wandered amongst us, and great will be the pleasure of Hortengur when Tharban drags before him the mad fool who dared prick the great Jeddak with his sword." Then they left him to the silence and the darkness. For what seemed hours Carthoris squatted upon the stone floor of his prison, his back against the wall in which was sunk the heavy eye-bolt that secured the chain which held him. Then, from out of the mysterious blackness before him, there came to his ears the sound of naked feet moving stealthily upon stone, approaching nearer and nearer to where he lay, unarmed and defenseless. Minutes passed, minutes that seemed hours, during which time periods of sepulchral silence would be followed by a repetition of the uncanny scraping of naked feet slinking warily upon him. At last he heard a sudden rush of unshod soles across the empty blackness, and at a little distance a scuffling sound, heavy breathing, and once what he thought the muttered imprecation of a man battling against great odds. Then the clanging of a chain, and a noise as of the snapping back against stone of a broken link. Again came silence, but for a moment only. Now he heard once more the soft feet approaching him. He thought that he discerned wicked eyes gleaming fearfully at him through the darkness. He knew that he could hear the heavy breathing of powerful lungs. Then came the rush of many feet toward him, and the things were upon him. Hands terminating in man-like fingers clutched at his throat, and arms and legs, hairy bodies strained and struggled against his own smooth hide as he battled in grim silence against these horrid foemen in the darkness of the pits of ancient Anther. Feud like some giant god was Carthoris of Helium, yet in the clutches of these unseen creatures of the pit's Stygian night he was helpless as a frail woman. Yet he battled on, striking futile blows against great, hispid breasts he could not see, feeling thick, squat throats beneath his fingers, the drool of saliva upon his cheek, and hot, foul breath in his nostrils. Fangs, too, mighty fangs, he knew were close, and why they did not sink into his flesh he could not guess. At last he became aware of the mighty surging of a number of his antagonists back and forth upon the great chain that held him, and soon came the same sound that he had heard at a little distance from him a short time before he had been attacked. His chain had parted and the broken end snapped back against the stone wall. Now he was seized upon either side, and dragged at a rapid pace through the dark corridors, toward what fate he could not even guess. At first he had thought his foes may be of the tribe of Torquas, but their hairy bodies belied that belief. Now he was at last quite sure of their identity, though why they had not killed and devoured him at once he could not imagine. After half an hour or more of rapid racing through the underground passages that are a distinguishing feature of all Barsumian cities, modern as well as ancient, his captors suddenly emerged into the moonlight of a courtyard far from the central plaza. Immediately Carthoris saw that he was in the power of a tribe of the great white apes of Barsum. All that had caused him doubt before as to the identity of his attackers was the hairiness of their breasts, for the white apes are entirely hairless except for a great shock bristling from their heads. Now he saw the cause of that which had deceived him. Across the chest of each of them were strips of hairy hide, usually of banth, in imitation of the harness of the green warriors who so often camped at their deserted city. Carthoris had read of the existence of tribes of apes that seemed to be progressing slowly toward higher standards of intelligence. Into the hands of such, he realized he had fallen, but what were their intentions toward him? As he glanced about the courtyard, he saw fully 50 of the hideous beasts, squatting on their haunches, and at a little distance from him another human being, closely guarded. As his eyes met those of his fellow captive, a smile lit the other's face, and Kaor, Red Man, burst from his lips. It was Carcomac, the bowman. Kaor, cried Carthoris in response. How came you here, and what befell the princess? Red men like yourself descended in mighty ships that sailed the air, evening as the great ships of my distant day sailed the 5 seas, replied Carcomac. They fought with the green men of Turquoise. They slew Comel, god of Lothar. I thought they were your friends, and I was glad when finally those of them who survived the battle carried the red girl to one of the ships and sailed away with her into the safety of the high air. Then the green men seized me and carried me to a great, empty city, where they chained me to a wall in a black pit. Afterward came these and dragged me here. And what of you, Red Man? Carthoris related all that had befallen him, and as the 2 men talked, the great apes squatted about them, watching them intently. What are we to do now? Asked the bowman. Our case looks rather hopeless, replied Carthoris ruefully. These creatures are born man-eaters. Why they have not already devoured us I cannot imagine. There, he whispered. See, the end is coming. Carcomac looked in the direction Carthoris indicated to see a huge ape advancing with a mighty bludgeon. It is thus they like best to kill their prey, said Carthoris. Must we die without a struggle? Asked Carcomac. Not I, replied Carthoris, though I know how futile our best defense must be against these mighty brutes. Oh, for a long sword, or a good bow, added Carcomac, and a Wutan of bowmen. At the words Carthoris half sprang to his feet, only to be dragged roughly down by his guard. Carcomac, he cried, why cannot you do what Tario and Jav did? They had no bowmen other than those of their own creation. You must know the secret of their power. Call forth your own Utan, Carcomac. The Letharian looked at Carthoris in wide-eyed astonishment as the full purport of the suggestion bore in upon his understanding. Why not? He murmured. The savage ape bearing the mighty bludgeon was slinking toward Carthoris. The Heliumite's fingers were working as he kept his eyes upon his executioner. Carcomac bent his gaze penetratingly upon the apes. The effort of his mind was evidenced in the sweat upon his contracted brows. The creature that was to slay the Red Man was almost within arm's reach of his prey when Carthoris heard a hoarse shout from the opposite side of the courtyard. In common with the squatting apes and the demon with the club, he turned in the direction of the sound, to see a company of sturdy bowmen rushing from the doorway of a nearby building. With screams of rage, the apes leaped to their feet to meet the charge. A volley of arrows met them halfway, sending a dozen rolling lifeless to the ground. Then the apes closed with their adversaries. All their attention was occupied by the attackers. Evening the guard had deserted the prisoners to join in the battle. Come, whispered Carcomac. Now may we escape, while their attention is diverted from us by my bowmen, and leave those brave fellows leaderless, cried Carthoris, whose loyal nature revolted at the merest suggestion of such a thing. Carcomac laughed. You forget, he said, that they are but thin air, figments of my brain. They will vanish unscathed when we have no further need for them. Praised be your first ancestor, Redman, that you thought of this chance in time. It would never have occurred to me to imagine that I may wield the same power that brought me into existence. You are right, said Carthoris. Still, I hate to leave them, though there is naught else to do. And so the 2 turned from the courtyard, and making their way into one of the broad avenues, crept stealthily in the shadows of the building toward the great central plaza upon which were the buildings occupied by the Green Warriors when they visited the deserted city. When they had come to the plaza's edge, Carthoris halted. Wait here, he whispered. I go to fetch Thotes. since on foot we may never hope to escape the clutches of these green fiends. To reach the courtyard where the thoats were kept, it was necessary for Carthoris to pass through one of the buildings which surrounded the square, which were occupied and which not he could not evening guess, so he was compelled to take considerable chances to gain the enclosure, in which he could hear the restless beasts squealing and quarreling among themselves. Chance carried him through a dark doorway into a large chamber in which lay a score or more green warriors wrapped in their sleeping silks and furs. Scarce had Carthoris passed through the short hallway that connected the door of the building and the great room beyond it than he became aware of the presence of something or someone in the hallway through which he had but just passed. He heard a man yawn, and then, behind him, he saw the figure of a sentry rise from where the fellow had been dozing, and stretching himself resume his wakeful watchfulness. Carthoris realized that he must have passed within a foot of the warrior, doubtless rousing him from his slumber. To retreat now would be impossible, yet to cross through that roomful of sleeping warriors seemed almost equally beyond the pale of possibility. Carthoris shrugged his broad shoulders and chose the lesser evil. Warily he entered the room. At his right, against the wall, leaned several swords and rifles and spears, extra weapons which the warriors had stacked here ready to their hands should there be a night alarm calling them suddenly from slumber. Beside each sleeper lay his weapon. These were never far from their owners from childhood to death. The sight of the swords made the young man's palm itch. He stepped quickly to them, selecting 2 short swords, one for Carcomac, the other for himself, also some trappings for his naked comrade. Then he started directly across the center of the apartment among the sleeping Torquasians. Not a man of them moved until Carthoris had completed more than half of the short though dangerous journey. Then a fellow directly in his path turned restlessly upon his sleeping silks and furs. The Heliumite paused above him, one of the short swords in readiness should the warrior awaken. For what seemed an eternity to the young prince, the green man continued to move uneasily upon his couch. Then, as though actuated by springs, he leaped to his feet and faced the red man. Instantly Carthoris struck, but not before a savage grunt escaped the other's lips. In an instant the room was in turmoil. Warriors leaped to their feet, grasping their weapons as they rose, and shouting to one another for an explanation of the disturbance. To Carthoris all within the room was plainly visible in the dim light reflected from without, for the further moon stood directly at zenith. But to the eyes of the newly awakened green men objects as yet had not taken on familiar forms. They but saw vaguely the figures of warriors moving about their apartment. Now one stumbled against the corpse of him whom Carthoris had slain. The fellow stooped and his hand came in contact with the cleft skull. He saw about him the giant figures of other green men, and so he jumped to the only conclusion that was open to him. "The thirds," he cried, "the thirds are upon us. Rise, warriors of Torquas, and drive home your swords within the hearts of Torquas' ancient enemies." Instantly the green men began to fall upon one another with naked swords. Their savage lust of battle was aroused. To fight, to kill, to die with cold steel buried in their vitals. Ah, that to them was nirvana. Carthoris was quick to guess their error and take advantage of it. He knew that in the pleasure of killing they may fight on long after they had discovered their mistake, unless their attention was distracted by sight of the real cause of the altercation, and so he lost no time in continuing across the room to the doorway upon the opposite side, which opened into the inner court, where the savage thoats were squealing and fighting among themselves. Once here he had no easy task before him. To catch and mount one of these habitually rageful and intractable beasts was no child's play under the best of conditions, but now, when silence and time were such important considerations, it may well have seemed quite hopeless to a less resourceful and optimistic man than the son of the great warlord. From his father he had learned much concerning the traits of these mighty beasts, and from Tars Tarkas, also, when he had visited that great green Jeddak among his horde at Thark. So now he sent it upon the work in hand all that he had ever learned about them from others and from his own experience, for he, too, had ridden and handled them many times. The temper of the Thoats of Torquas appeared evening shorter than their vicious cousins among the Tharks and Warhoons, and for a time it seemed unlikely that he should escape a savage charge on the part of a couple of old bulls that circled, squealing, about him, but at last he managed to get close enough to one of them to touch the beast. With the feel of his hand upon the sleek hide the creature quieted, and in answer to the telepathic command of the red man sank to its knees. In a moment Carthoris was upon its back, guiding it toward the great gate that leads from the courtyard through a large building at one end into an avenue beyond. The other bull, still squealing and enraged, followed after his fellow. There was no bridle upon either, for these strange creatures are controlled entirely by suggestion, when they are controlled at all. Evening in the hands of the giant green men bridle reins would be hopelessly futile against the mad savagery and mastodonic strength of the Thoat, and so they are guided by that strange telepathic power with which the men of Mars have learned to communicate in a crude way with the lower orders of their planet. With difficulty Carthoris urged the two beasts to the gate, where, leaning down, he raised the latch. Then the Thoat that he was riding placed his great shoulder to the skeel-wood planking, pushed through, and a moment later the man and the two beasts were swinging silently down the avenue to the edge of the plaza, where Carcomac hid. Here Carthoris found considerable difficulty in subduing the second Thoat, and as Carcomac had never before ridden one of the beasts, it seemed a most hopeless job, but at last the bowman managed to scramble to the sleek back, and again the two beasts fled softly down the moss-grown avenues toward the open sea bottom beyond the city. All that night, and the following day, and the second night they rode toward the northeast. No indication of pursuit developed, and at dawn of the second day Carthoris saw in the distance the waving ribbon of great trees that marked one of the long Barsoomian waterways. Immediately they abandoned their Thoats and approached the cultivated district on foot. Carthoris also discarded the metal from his harness, or such of it as may serve to identify him as a Heliumite, or of royal blood, for he did not know to what nation belonged this waterway, and upon Mars it is always well to assume every man and nation your enemy until you have learned the contrary. It was a mid-forenoon when the two at last entered one of the roads that cut through the cultivated districts at regular intervals, joining the arid wastes on either side with the great, white, central highway that follows through the center from end to end of the far-reaching, thread-like farmlands. The high wall surrounding the fields served as a protection against surprise by raiding green hordes, as well as keeping the savage banths and other carnivora from the domestic animals and the human beings upon the farms. Carthoris stopped before the first gate he came to, pounding for admission. The young man who answered his summons greeted the two hospitably, though he looked with considerable wonder upon the white skin and auburn hair of the bowman. After he had listened for a moment to a partial narration of their escape from the Torquasians, he invited them within, took them to his house, and bade the servants there prepare food for them. As they waited in the low-ceiled, pleasant living room of the farmhouse until the meal should be ready, Carthoris drew his host into conversation that he may learn his nationality, and thus the nation under whose dominion lay the waterway where circumstance had placed him. "I am Hal Vass," said the young man, son of Vass Cor of Dusar, a noble in the retinue of Vostok, Prince of Dusar. "At present I am dwar of the road for this district." Carthoris was very glad that he had not disclosed his identity, for though he had no idea of anything that had transpired since he had left Helium, or that Vostok was at the bottom of all his misfortunes, he well knew that the Dusarian had no love for him, and that he could hope for no assistance within the dominions of Dusar. "And who are you?" asked Hal Vass. "By your appearance I take you for a fighting man, but I see no insignia upon your harness. Can it be that you are a Panthan?" Now, these wandering soldiers of fortune are common upon Barsoom, where most men love to fight. They sell their services wherever war exists, and in the occasional brief intervals when there is no organized warfare between the Red Nations, they join one of the numerous expeditions that are constantly being dispatched against the Green Men in protection of the waterways that traverse the wilder portions of the globe. When their service is over they discard the metal of the nation they have been serving until they shall have found a new master. In the intervals they wear no insignia. their war-worn harness and grim weapons being sufficient to attest their calling. The suggestion was a happy one, and Carthoris embraced the chance it afforded to account satisfactorily for himself. There was, however, a single drawback. In times of war, such pantheons as happened to be within the domain of a belligerent nation were compelled to don the insignia of that nation and fight with her warriors. As far as Carthoris knew, Dusar was not at war with any other nation, but there was never any telling when one red nation would be flying at the throat of a neighbor. Evening though the great and powerful alliance at the head of which was his father, John Carter, had managed to maintain a long peace upon the greater portion of Barsoom. A pleasant smile lighted Hal Vast's face as Carthoris admitted his vocation. "It is well," exclaimed the young man, "that you chanced to come here, for here you will find the means of obtaining service in short order." Chapter 12. To save Dusar, Thuvia of Tarth, battling for more than life against the lust of Jaff, cast a quick glance over her shoulder toward the forest from which had rumbled the fierce growl. Jav looked, too. What they saw filled each with apprehension. It was Komal, the Banthvad, rushing wide-jawed upon them. Which had he chosen for his prey, or was it to be both? They had not long to wait, for though the Lotharian attempted to hold the girl between himself and the terrible fangs, the great beast found him at last. Then, shrieking, he attempted to fly toward Lothar, after pushing Thuvia bodily into the face of the man-eater. But his flight was of short duration. In a moment Komal was upon him, rending his throat and chest with demoniacal fury. The girl reached their side a moment later, but it was with difficulty that she tore the mad beast from its prey. Still growling, and casting hungry glances back upon Jaff, the Banth at last permitted itself to be led away into the wood. With her giant protector by her side, Thuvia set forth to find the passage through the cliffs, that she may attempt the seemingly impossible feat of reaching far distant Tarth across the more than 17,000 hods of savage Barsoom. She could not believe that Carthoris had deliberately deserted her, and so she kept a constant watch for him. But as she bore too far to the north in her search for the tunnel, she passed the Heliumite as he was returning to Lothar in search of her. Thuvia of Tarth was having difficulty in determining the exact status of the Prince of Helium in her heart. She could not admit evening to herself that she loved him, and yet she had permitted him to apply to her that term of endearment and possession to which a Barsoomian maid should turn deaf ears when voiced by other lips than those of her husband or fiancé. "My princess." Kiolan Tithe, Jeddak of Kaol, to whom she was affianced, commanded her respect and admiration. Had it been that she had surrendered to her father's wishes because of pique that the handsome Heliumite had not taken advantage of his visits to her father's court to push the suit for her hand that she had been quite sure he had contemplated since that distant day the two had sat together upon the carved seat within the gorgeous garden of the Jeddaks that graced the inner courtyard of the palace of Salensis at Cadabra. Did she love Kiolan Tithe? Bravely she tried to believe that she did, but all the while her eyes wandered through the coming darkness for the figure of a clean-limbed fighting man, black-haired and gray-eyed. Black was the hair of Kiolan Tithe, but his eyes were brown. It was almost dark when she found the entrance to the tunnel. Safely she passed through to the hills beyond, and here, under the bright light of Mars' 2 moons, she halted to plan her future action. Should she wait here in the hope that Carthoris would return in search of her, or should she continue her way northeast toward Tarth, where, first, would Carthoris have gone after leaving the valley of Lothar? Her parched throat and dry tongue gave her the answer: toward Anther and water. Well, she, too, would go first to Anther, where she may find more than the water she needed. With Komal by her side she felt little fear, for he would protect her from all other savage beasts. Evening the great white apes would flee the mighty Banth in terror. Men only need she fear, but she must take this and many other chances before she could hope to reach her father's court again. When at last Carthoris found her, only to be struck down by the long sword of a green man, Thuvia prayed that the same fate may overtake her. The sight of the red warriors leaping from their flyers had, for a moment, filled her with renewed hope that Carthoris of Helium may be only stunned and that they would rescue him. But when she saw the Dusarian metal upon their harness, and that they sought only to escape with her alone from the charging turquoise ions. She gave up. Komal, too, was dead, dead across the body of the heliumite. She was, truly, alone now. There was none to protect her. The Ducerian warriors dragged her to the deck of the nearest flyer. All about them the green warriors surged in an attempt to wrest her from the red. At last those who had not died in the conflict gained the decks of the two craft. The engines throbbed and purred, the propellers whirred. Quickly the swift boats shot heavenward. Thuvia of Tarth glanced about her. A man stood near, smiling down into her face. With a gasp of recognition she looked full into his eyes, and then with a little moan of terror and understanding she buried her face in her hands and sank to the polished skeelwood deck. It was a stock, Prince of Dusar, who bent above her. Swift were the flyers of a stock of Dusar, and great the need for reaching his father's court as quickly as possible, for the fleets of war of Helium and Tarth and Kaal were scattered far and wide above Barsoom. Nor would it go well with the stock of Dusar should any one of them discover Thuvia of Tarth a prisoner upon his own vessel. And there lies in 50 south latitude and 40 east of Horrors, the deserted seat of ancient Barsoomian culture and learning, while Dusar lies 15 degrees north of the equator and 20 degrees east from Horrors. Great though the distance is, the flyers covered it without a stop. Long before they had reached their destination, Thuvia of Tarth had learned several things that cleared up the doubts that had assailed her mind for many days. Scarce had they risen above Anther than she recognized one of the crew as a member of the crew of that other flyer that had borne her from her father's gardens to Anther. The presence of the stock upon the craft settled the whole question. She had been stolen by emissaries of the Ducerian prince. Carthoris of Helium had had nothing to do with it. Nor did a stock deny the charge when Shiva accused him. He only smiled and pleaded his love for her. "I would sooner mate with a white ape," she cried, when he would have urged his suit. A stock glowered sullenly upon her. "You shall mate with me, Thuvia of Tarth," he growled, "or, by your first ancestor, you shall have your preference, and mate with a white ape." The girl made no reply, nor could he draw her into conversation during the balance of the journey. As a matter of fact, stock was a trifle awed by the proportions of the conflict which his abduction of the Tarthian princess had induced, nor was he over-comfortable with the weight of responsibility which the possession of such a prisoner entailed. His one thought was to get her to Dusar, and there let his father assume the responsibility. In the meantime he would be as careful as possible to do nothing to affront her, lest they all may be captured, and he have to account for his treatment of the girl to one of the great Jedeks whose interest centered in her. And so at last they came to Dusar, where a stock hid his prisoner in a secret room high in the east tower of his own palace. He had sworn his men to silence in the matter of the identity of the girl, for until he had seen his father, Nudis, Jedek of Dusar, he dared not let anyone know whom he had brought with him from the south. But when he appeared in the great audience chamber before the cruel-lipped man who was his sire, he found his courage oozing, and he dared not speak of the princess hid within his palace. It occurred to him to test his father's sentiments upon the subject, and so he told a tale of capturing one who claimed to know the whereabouts of Thuvia of Tarth. "And if you command it, sire," he said, "I will go and capture her, fetching her here to Dusar." Nudis frowned and shook his head. "You have done enough already to set Tarth and Kaal and Helium all three upon us at once should they learn your part in the theft of the Tarth princess. That you succeeded in shifting the guilt upon the Prince of Helium was fortunate, and a masterly move of strategy, but were the girl to know the truth and ever return to her father's court, all Dusar would have to pay the penalty, and to have her here a prisoner amongst us would be an admission of guilt from the consequences of which naught could save us. It would cost me my throne, a stock, and that I have no mind to lose. If we had her here." The elder man suddenly commenced to muse, repeating the phrase again and again. "If we had her here, a stock," he exclaimed fiercely. "Ah, if we but had her here, and none knew that she was here. Can you not guess, man? The guilt of Dusar may be forever buried with her bones," he concluded in a low, savage whisper. Estok, Prince of Dusar, shuddered. Weak he was, yes, and wicked, too, but the suggestion that his father's words implied turned him cold with horror. Cruel to their enemies are the men of Mars, but the word enemies is commonly interpreted to mean men only. Assassination runs riot in the great Barsumian cities, yet to murder a woman is a crime so unthinkable that even the most hardened of the paid assassins would shrink from you in horror should you suggest such a thing to him. Nudus was apparently oblivious to his son's all too patent terror at his suggestion. Soon he continued, "You say that you know where the girl lies hid, since she was stolen from your people at Anther. Should she be found by any one of the three powers, her unsupported story would be sufficient to turn them all against us." "There is but one way, Astok," cried the older man. "You must return at once to her hiding place, and fetch her here in all secrecy. And, look you here, return not to Dusar without her, upon pain of death." Astok, Prince of Dusar, well knew his royal father's temper. He knew that in the tyrant's heart there pulsed no single throb of love for any creature. Astok's mother had been a slave woman. Nudis had never loved her. He had never loved another. In youth he had tried to find a bride at the courts of several of his powerful neighbors, but their women would have none of him. After a dozen daughters of his own nobility had sought self-destruction rather than wed him, he had given up. And then it had been that he had legally wed one of his slaves that he may have a son to stand among the Jeds when Nudis died, and a new Jedak was chosen. Slowly Astok withdrew from the presence of his father. With white face and shaking limbs he made his way to his own palace. As he crossed the courtyard his glance chanced to wander to the great east tower looming high against the azure of the sky. At sight of it beads of sweat broke out upon his brow. Issus, no other hand than his could be trusted to do the horrid thing. With his own fingers he must crush the life from that perfect throat, or plunge the silent blade into the red, red heart. Her heart, the heart that he had hoped would brim with love for him. But had it done so? He recalled the haughty contempt with which his protestations of love had been received. He went cold and then hot to the memory of it. His compunctions cooled as the self-satisfaction of a near revenge crowded out the finer instincts that had for a moment asserted themselves. The good that he had inherited from the slave woman was once again submerged in the bad blood that had come down to him from his royal sire, as, in the end, it always was. A cold smile supplanted the terror that had dilated his eyes. He turned his steps toward the tower. He would see her before he set out upon the journey that was to blind his father to the fact that the girl was already in Dusar. Quietly he passed in through the secret way, ascending the spiral runway to the apartment in which the Princess of Tarth was immured. As he entered the room he saw the girl leaning upon the sill of the east casement, gazing out across the roof-tops of Dusar toward distant Tarth. He hated Tarth. The thought of it filled him with rage. Why not finish her now and have it done with? At the sound of his step she turned quickly toward him. Ah, how beautiful she was! His sudden determination faded beneath the glorious light of her wondrous beauty. He would wait until he had returned from his little journey of deception. Maybe there may be some other way then, some other hand to strike the blow. With that face, with those eyes before him, he could never do it. Of that he was positive. He had always gloried in the cruelty of his nature, but Issus, he was not that cruel. No, another must be found, one whom he could trust. He was still looking at her as she stood there before him, meeting his gaze steadily and unafraid. He felt the hot passion of his love mounting higher and higher. Why not sue once more? If she would relent, all may yet be well. Evening, if his father could not be persuaded, they could fly to Tarth, laying all the blame of the knavery and intrigue that had thrown four great nations into war upon the shoulders of Nudis. And who was there that would doubt the justice of the charge? "Thuvia," he said, "I come once again, for the last time, to lay my heart at your feet. Tarth and Kaal and Dusar are battling with Helium because of you. Wed me, Thuvia, and all may yet be as it should be." The girl shook her head. "Wait," he commanded, before she could speak. "Know the truth before you speak words that may seal not only your own fate, but that of the thousands of warriors who battle because of you. refuse to wed me willingly, and Dusar would be laid waste should ever the truth be known to Tarth, and Caol and Helium. They would raze our cities, leaving not one stone upon another. They would scatter our peoples across the face of Barsoom from the frozen north to the frozen south, hunting them down and slaying them, until this great nation remained only as a hated memory in the minds of men. But while they are exterminating the Dusarians, countless thousands of their own warriors must perish, and all because of the stubbornness of a single woman who would not wed the prince who loves her. Refuse, Thuvia of Tarth, and there remains but a single alternative. No man must ever know your fate. Only a handful of loyal servitors besides my royal father and myself know that you were stolen from the gardens of Thuvendihn by a stalk, Prince of Dusar, or that today you be imprisoned in my palace. Refuse, Thuvia of Tarth, and you must die to save Dusar. There is no other way. Nudis, the Jeddak, has so decreed. I have spoken. For a long moment the girl let her level gaze rest full upon the face of a stalk of Dusar. Then she spoke, and though the words were few, the unimpassioned tone carried unfathomable depths of cold contempt. Better all that you have threatened, she said, than you. Then she turned her back upon him and went to stand once more before the east window, gazing with sad eyes toward distant Tarth. A stalk wheeled and left the room, returning after a short interval of time with food and drink. Here, he said, is sustenance until I return again. The next to enter this apartment will be your executioner. Commend yourself to your ancestors, Thuvia of Tarth, for within a few days you shall be with them. Then he was gone. Half an hour later he was interviewing an officer high in the navy of Dusar. Where went Vascour? He asked. He is not at his palace. South, to the great waterway that skirts Torquoise, replied the other. Chapter 13. Turgeon, the Panthan. The face of Carthoris of Helium gave no token of the emotions that convulsed him inwardly as he heard from the lips of Halvas that Helium was at war with Dusar, and that fate had thrown him into the service of the enemy. That he may utilize this opportunity to the good of Helium scarce sufficed to outweigh the chagrin he felt. That he was not fighting in the open at the head of his own loyal troops. To escape the Dusarians may prove an easy matter, and then again it may not. Should they suspect his loyalty, and the loyalty of an impressed Panthan was always open to suspicion, he may not find an opportunity to elude their vigilance until after the termination of the war, which may occur within days, or, again, only after long and weary years of bloodshed. He recalled that history recorded wars in which actual military operations had been carried on without cessation for 500 or 600 years, and even now there were nations upon Barsoom with which Helium had made no peace within the history of man. The outlook was not cheering. He could not guess that within a few hours he would be blessing the fate that had thrown him into the service of Dusar. Ah! Exclaimed Halvas, here is my father now. Kr. Vascour, here is one you will be glad to meet, a doughty Panthan. He hesitated. Turgeon, interjected Carthoris, seizing upon the first appellation that occurred to him. As he spoke, his eyes crossed quickly to the tall warrior who was entering the room. Where before had he seen that giant figure, that taciturn countenance, and the livid sword cut from temple to mouth? Vascour, repeated Carthoris mentally. Vascour, where had he seen the man before? And then the noble spoke, and like a flash it all came back to Carthoris, the forward servant upon the landing stage at Tarth. That time that he had been explaining the intricacies of his new compass to Thuvendin, the lone slave that had guarded his own hangar that night he had left upon his ill-fated journey for Tarth, the journey that had brought him so mysteriously to far Anther. Vascour, he repeated aloud, blessed be your ancestors for this meeting. Nor did the Dusarian guess the wealth of meaning that lay beneath that hackneyed phrase with which a Barsoomian acknowledges an introduction. And blessed be yours, Turgeon, replied Vascour. Now came the introduction of Carcomac to Vascour, and as Carthoris went through the little ceremony there came to him the only explanation he may make to account for the white skin and auburn hair of the bowman, for he feared that the truth may not be believed and thus suspicion be cast upon them both from the beginning. Carcomac, he explained, is, as you can see, a Thurn. He has wandered far from his ice-bound southern temples in search of adventure. I came upon him in the pits of Anther, but though I have known him so short a time, I can vouch for his bravery and loyalty. Since the destruction of the fabric of their false religion by John Carter, the majority of the Thurns had gladly accepted the new order of things, so that it was now no longer uncommon to see them mingling with the multitudes of red men in any of the great cities of the outer world. So Vascour neither felt nor expressed any great astonishment. All during the interview Carthoris watched, cat-like, for some indication that Vascour recognized in the battered panthan the erstwhile gorgeous Prince of Helium. But the sleepless nights, the long days of marching and fighting, the wounds and the dried blood had evidently sufficed to obliterate the last remnant of his likeness to his former self, and then Vascour had seen him but twice in all his life. Little wonder that he did not know him. During the evening Vascour announced that on the tomorrow they should depart north toward Dusar, picking up recruits at various stations along the way. In a great field behind the house a flyer lay, a fair-sized cruiser transport that would accommodate many men, yet swift and well-armed also. Here Carthoris slept, and Carcomac, too, with the other recruits, under guard of the regular Dusarian warriors that manned the craft. Toward midnight Vascour returned to the vessel from his son's house, repairing at once to his cabin. Carthoris, with one of the Dusarians, was on watch. It was with difficulty that the Heliumite repressed a cold smile as the noble passed within a foot of him, within a foot of the long, slim, heliumitic blade that swung in his harness. How easy it would have been, how easy to avenge the cowardly trick that had been played upon him, to avenge Helium and Tarth and Thuvia. But his hand moved not toward the dagger's hilt, for first Vascour must serve a better purpose. He may know where Thuvia of Tarth lay hidden now, if it had truly been Dusarians that had spirited her away during the fight before Anther. And then, too, there was the instigator of the entire foul plot. He must pay the penalty, and who better than Vascour could lead the Prince of Helium to a stock of Dusar? Faintly out of the night there came to Carthoris's ears the purring of a distant motor. He scanned the heavens. Yes, there it was far in the north, dimly outlined against the dark void of space that stretched illimitably beyond it, the faint suggestion of a flyer passing, unlighted, through the Barsoomian night. Carthoris, knowing not whether the craft may be friend or foe of Dusar, gave no sign that he had seen, but turned his eyes in another direction, leaving the matter to the Dusarian who stood watch with him. Soon the fellow discovered the oncoming craft and sounded the low alarm, which brought the balance of the watch and an officer from their sleeping silks and furs upon the deck nearby. The cruiser transport lay without lights, and resting as she was upon the ground must have been entirely invisible to the oncoming flyer, which all soon recognized as a small craft. It soon became evident that the stranger intended making a landing, for she was now spiraling slowly above them, dropping lower and lower in each graceful curve. "It is the Thuvia," whispered one of the Dusarian warriors. "I would know her in the blackness of the pits among 10,000 other craft." "Right you are," exclaimed Vascour, who had come on deck, and then he hailed, "Kaor, Thuvia, Kaor," came soon from above after a brief silence. Then, "What ship?" "Cruiser transport Calxus, Vascour of Dusar." "Good," came from above. "Is there safe landing alongside?" "Yes, close into starboard." "Wait, we will show our lights," and a moment later the smaller craft settled close beside the Calxus, and the lights of the latter were immediately extinguished once more. Several figures could be seen slipping over the side of the Thuvia and advancing toward the Calxus. Ever suspicious, the Dusarians stood ready to receive the visitors as friends or foes as closer inspection may prove them. Carthoris stood quite near the rail, ready to take sides with the newcomers should chance have it that they were Heliumites playing a bold stroke of strategy upon this lone Dusarian ship. He had led like parties himself, and knew that such a contingency was quite possible. But the face of the first man to cross the rail undeceived him with a shock that was not at all unpleasurable. It was the face of Astok, Prince of Dusar. Scarce noticing the others upon the deck of the Calxus, Astok strode forward to accept Vascor's greeting. Then he summoned the noble below. The warriors and officers returned to their sleeping silks and furs, and once more the deck was deserted except for the Dusarian warrior and Turgeon, the Panthan, who stood guard. The latter walked quietly to and fro. The former leaned across the rail, wishing for the hour that would bring him relief. He did not see his companion approach the lights of the cabin of Vascor. He did not see him stoop with ear close pressed to a tiny ventilator. "May the white apes take us all," cried Astok ruefully, "if we are not in as ugly a snarl as you have ever seen. Nudis thinks that we have her in hiding far away from Dusar. He has bidden me bring her here." He paused. No man should have heard from his lips the thing he was trying to tell. It should have been forever the secret of Nudis and Astok, for upon it rested the safety of a throne. With that knowledge any man could wrest from the Jeddak of Dusar whatever he listed. But Astok was afraid, and he wanted from this older man the suggestion of an alternative. He went on. "I am to kill her," he whispered, looking fearfully around. "Nudis merely wishes to see the body that he may know his commands have been executed. I am now supposed to be gone to the spot where we have her hidden that I may fetch her in secrecy to Dusar. None is to know that she has ever been in the keeping of a Dusarian. I do not need to tell you what would befall Dusar should Tarth and Helium and Kael ever learn the truth." The jaws of the listener at the ventilator clicked together with a vicious snap. Before he had but guessed at the identity of the subject of this conversation. Now he knew, and they were to kill her. His muscular fingers clenched until the nails bit into the palms. "And you wish me to go with you while you fetch her to Dusar," Vascor was saying. "Where is she?" Astok bent close and whispered into the other's ear. The suggestion of a smile crossed the cruel features of Vascor. He realized the power that lay within his grasp. He should be a Jed at least. "And how may I help you, my prince?" asked the older man suavely. "I cannot kill her," said Astok. "Issus, I cannot do it. When she turns those eyes upon me my heart becomes water." Vascor's eyes narrowed. "And you wish," he paused, the interrogation unfinished, yet complete. Astok nodded. "You do not love her," he said. "But I love my life, though I am only a lesser noble," he concluded meaningly. "You shall be a greater noble, a noble of the first rank," exclaimed Astok. "I would be a Jed," said Vascor bluntly. Astok hesitated. "A Jed must die before there can be another Jed," he pleaded. "Jeds have died before," snapped Vascor. "It would doubtless be not difficult for you to find a Jed you do not love. Astok, there are many who do not love you." Already Vascor was commencing to presume upon his power over the young prince. Astok was quick to note and appreciate the subtle change in his lieutenant. A cunning scheme entered his weak and wicked brain. "As you say, Vascor," he exclaimed, "you shall be a Jed when the thing is done, and then," to himself, "nor will it then be difficult for me to find a Jed I do not love." "When shall we return to Dusar?" asked the noble. "At once," replied Astok. "Let us get under way now. There is naught to keep you here. I had intended sailing on the tomorrow, picking up such recruits as the various dwarves of the roads may have collected for me, as we return to Dusar." "Let the recruits wait," said Astok. "Or, better still, come you to Dusar upon the Thuvia, leaving the Calxus to follow and pick up the recruits." "Yes," acquiesced Vascor, "that is the better plan. Come, I am ready," and he rose to accompany Astok to the latter's flyer. The listener at the ventilator came to his feet slowly, like an old man. His face was drawn and pinched and very white beneath the light copper of his skin. She was to die, and he helpless to avert the tragedy. He did not even know where she was imprisoned. The two men were ascending from the cabin to the deck. Turgeon, the Panthan, crept close to the companionway, his sinuous fingers closing tightly upon the hilt of his dagger. Could he dispatch them both before he was overpowered? He smiled. He could slay an entire Rutan of her enemies in his present state of mind. They were almost abreast of him now. Estok was speaking. "Bring a couple of your men along, Vascor," he said. "We are short-handed upon the Thuvia." So quickly did we depart. The Panthan's fingers dropped from the dagger's hilt. His quick mind had grasped here a chance for succoring Thuvia of Tarth. He may be chosen as one to accompany the assassins, and once he had learned where the captive lay, he could dispatch Estok and Vascor as well as now. To kill them before he knew where Thuvia was hid was simply to leave her to death at the hands of others. For sooner or later Nudis would learn her whereabouts, and Nudis, Jeddak of Dusar, could not afford to let her live. Turgeon put himself in the path of Vascor, that he may not be overlooked. The noble aroused the men sleeping upon the deck, but always before him the strange Panthan whom he had recruited. That same day found means for keeping himself to the fore. Vascor turned to his lieutenant, giving instruction for the bringing of the Calxus to Dusar, and the gathering up of the recruits. Then he signed to two warriors who stood close behind the Padwar. "You two accompany us to the Thuvia," he said, "and put yourselves at the disposal of her dwar." It was dark upon the deck of the Calxus, so Vascor had not a good look at the faces of the two he chose, but that was of no moment, for they were but common warriors to assist with the ordinary duties upon a flyer, and to fight if need be. One of the two was Carcomac, the bowman. The other was not Carthoris. The Heliumite was mad with disappointment. He snatched his dagger from his harness, but already Estok had left the deck of the Calxus, and he knew that before he could overtake him, should he dispatch Vascor, he would be killed by the Dusarian warriors, who now were thick upon the deck. With either one of the two alive, Thuvia was in as great danger as though both lived. It must be both. As Vascor descended to the ground, Carthoris boldly followed him, nor did any attempt to halt him, thinking, doubtless, that he was one of the party. After him came Carcomac, and the Dusarian warrior, who had been detailed to duty upon the Thuvia. Carthoris walked close to the left side of the latter. Now they came to the dense shadow under the side of the Thuvia. It was very dark there, so that they had to grope for the ladder. Carcomac preceded the Dusarian. The latter reached upward for the swinging rounds, and as he did so steel fingers closed upon his windpipe, and a steel blade pierced the very center of his heart. Turgeon, the Panthan, was the last to clamber over the rail of the Thuvia, drawing the rope ladder in after him. A moment later the flyer was rising rapidly, headed for the north. At the rail, Carcomac turned to speak to the warrior, who had been detailed to accompany him. His eyes went wide as they rested upon the face of the young man whom he had met beside the granite cliffs. That guard mysterious Lothar. How had he come in place of the Dusarian? A quick sign, and Carcomac turned once more to find the Thuvia's dwar, that he may report himself for duty. Behind him followed the Panthan. Carthoris blessed the chance that had caused Vascor to choose the bowman of all others, for had it been another Dusarian there would have been questions to answer as to the whereabouts of the warrior who lay so quietly in the field beyond the residence of Halvas, dwar of the southern road, and Carthoris had no answer to that question other than his sword point, which alone was scarce adequate to convince the entire crew of the Thuvia. The journey to Dusar seemed interminable to the impatient Carthoris, though as a matter of fact it was quickly accomplished. Some time before they reached their destination they met and spoke with another Dusarian war flyer. From it they learned that a great battle was soon to be fought southeast of Dusar. The combined navies of Dusar, Tarth, and Kaal had been intercepted in their advance toward Helium by the mighty Heliumitic navy, the most formidable upon Barsoom, not alone in numbers and armament, but in the training and courage of its officers and warriors, and the zitideric proportions of many of its monster battleships. Not for many a day had there been the promise of such a battle. 4 Jeddaks were in direct command of their own fleets, Kilin Tithe of Kaal, Thuvan Dihin of Tarth, and Nudis of Dusar upon one side, while upon the other was Tardos Mors, Jeddak of Helium. With the latter was John Carter, warlord of Mars. From the far north another force was moving south across the barrier cliffs, the new navy of Talu, Jeddak of Akkar, coming in response to the call from the warlord. A Upon the decks of the sullen ships of war, black-bearded yellow men looked over eagerly toward the south. Gorgeous were they in their splendid cloaks of Orluk and Apt, fierce, formidable fighters from the hothouse cities of the frozen north, and from the distant south, from the sea of Omian and the cliffs of gold, from the temples of the Therns and the garden of Isis, other thousands sailed into the north at the call of the great man they all had learned to respect and, respecting, love. Pacing the flagship of this mighty fleet, second only to the navy of Helium, was the Ebn Zadar, Jeddak of the firstborn, his heart beating strong in anticipation of the coming moment when he should hurl his savage crews and the weight of his mighty ships upon the enemies of the warlord. But would these allies reach the theater of war in time to be of avail to Helium? Or would Helium need them? Carthoris, with the other members of the crew of the Thuvia, heard the gossip and the rumors. None knew of the two fleets, the one from the south and the other from the north, that were coming to support the ships of Helium, and all of Dusar were convinced that nothing now could save the ancient power of Helium from being wiped forever from the upper air of Barsum. Carthoris, too, loyal son of Helium that he was, felt that evening his beloved navy may not be able to cope successfully with the combined forces of three great powers. Now the Thuria touched the landing stage above the palace of the stock. Hurriedly the prince and vast corps disembarked and entered the drop that would carry them to the lower levels of the palace. Close beside it was another drop that was utilized by common warriors. Carthoris touched Carcomac upon the arm. "Come," he whispered. "You are my only friend among a nation of enemies. Will you stand by me?" "To the death," replied Carcomac. The two approached the drop. A slave operated it. "Where are your passes?" he asked. Carthoris fumbled in his pocket pouch as though in search of them, at the same time entering the cage. Carcomac followed him, closing the door. The slave did not start the cage downward. Every second counted. They must reach the lower level as soon as possible after a stock and vast corps, if they would know where the two went. Carthoris turned suddenly upon the slave, hurling him to the opposite side of the cage. "Bind and gag him, Carcomac," he cried. Then he grasped the control lever, and as the cage shot downward at sickening speed, the bowman grappled with the slave. Carthoris could not leave the control to assist his companion, for should they touch the lowest level at the speed at which they were going, all would be dashed to instant death. Below him he could now see the top of a stock's cage in the parallel shaft, and he reduced the speed of his to that of the other. The slave commenced to scream. "Silence him," cried Carthoris. A moment later a limp form crumpled to the floor of the cage. "He is silenced," said Carcomac. Carthoris brought the cage to a sudden stop at one of the higher levels of the palace. Opening the door, he grasped the still form of the slave and pushed it out upon the floor. Then he banged the gate and resumed the downward drop. Once more he sighted the top of the cage that held a stock and vast corps. Chapter 14. Killantithe's Sacrifice. The morning of the second day of her incarceration in the east tower of the palace of Astok, Prince of Dusar, found Thuvia of Tarth waiting in dull apathy the coming of the assassin. She had exhausted every possibility of escape, going over and over again the door and the windows, the floor and the walls. The solid ursite slabs she could not even scratch. The tough Barsumian glass of the windows would have shattered to nothing less than a heavy sledge in the hands of a strong man. The door and the lock were impregnable. There was no escape, and they had stripped her of her weapons so that she could not even anticipate the hour of her doom, thus robbing them of the satisfaction of witnessing her last moments. When would they come? Would Astok do the deed with his own hands? She doubted that he had the courage for it. At heart he was a coward. She had known it since first she had heard him brag as a visitor at the court of her father. He had sought to impress her with his valor. She could not help but compare him with another. And with whom would an affianced bride compare an unsuccessful suitor? With her betrothed. And did Thuvia of Tarth now measure a stock of Dusar by the standards of Kilantith, Jeddak of Kaal, She was about to die. Her thoughts were her own to do with as she pleased, yet furthest from them was Kielan Tithe. Instead, the figure of the tall and comely Heliumite filled her mind, crowding therefrom all other images. She dreamed of his noble face, the quiet dignity of his bearing, the smile that lit his eyes as he conversed with his friends, and the smile that touched his lips as he fought with his enemies, the fighting smile of his Virginian sire. And Thuvia of Tarth, true daughter of Barsoom, found her breath quickening and heart leaping to the memory of this other smile, the smile that she would never see again. With a little half-sob the girl sank to the pile of silks and furs that were tumbled in confusion beneath the east windows, burying her face in her arms. In the corridor outside her prison room 2 men had paused in heated argument. "I tell you again, Astock," one was saying, "that I shall not do this thing unless you be present in the room." There was little of the respect due royalty in the tone of the speaker's voice. The other, noting it, flushed. "Do not impose too far upon my friendship for you, Vascour," he snapped. "There is a limit to my patience." "There is no question of royal prerogative here," returned Vascour. "You ask me to become an assassin in your stead and against your Jedek's strict injunctions. You are in no position, Astock, to dictate to me, but rather should you be glad to accede to my reasonable request that you be present, thus sharing the guilt with me. Why should I bear it all?" The younger man scowled, but he advanced toward the locked door, and as it swung in upon its hinges he entered the room beyond at the side of Vascour. Across the chamber the girl, hearing them enter, rose to her feet and faced them. Under the soft copper of her skin she blanched just a trifle, but her eyes were brave and level, and the haughty tilt of her firm little chin was eloquent of loathing and contempt. "You still prefer death?" asked Astock. "To you, yes," replied the girl coldly. The Prince of Dusar turned to Vascour and nodded. The noble drew his short sword and crossed the room toward Thuvia. "Kneel," he commanded. "I prefer to die standing," she replied. "As you will," said Vascour, feeling the point of his blade with his left thumb. "In the name of Nudis, Jeddak of Dusar," he cried, and ran quickly toward her. "In the name of Carthoris, Prince of Helium," came in low tones from the doorway. Vascour turned to see the panthan he had recruited at his son's house leaping across the floor toward him. The fellow brushed past Astock with an, "After him, you, Callot." Vascour wheeled to meet the charging man. "What means this treason?" he cried. Astock, with bared sword, leaped to Vascour's assistance. The panthan's sword clashed against that of the noble, and in the first encounter Vascour knew that he faced a master swordsman. Before he half realized the stranger's purpose he found the man between himself and Thuvia of Tarth, at bay facing the 2 swords of the Dusarians. But he fought not like a man at bay. Ever was he the aggressor, and though always he kept his flashing blade between the girl and her enemies, yet he managed to force them here and there about the room, calling to the girl to follow close behind him. Until it was too late neither Vascour nor Astock dreamed of that which lay in the panthan's mind, but at last as the fellow stood with his back toward the door, both understood. They were penned in their own prison, and now the intruder could slay them at his will, for Thuvia of Tarth was bolting the door at the man's direction, first taking the key from the opposite side, where Astock had left it when they had entered. Astock, as was his way, finding that the enemy did not fall immediately before their swords, was leaving the brunt of the fighting to Vascour, and now as his eyes appraised the panthan carefully they soon went wider and wider, for slowly he had come to recognize the features of the Prince of Helium. The Heliumite was pressing close upon Vascour. The noble was bleeding from a dozen wounds. Astock saw that he could not for long withstand the cunning craft of that terrible sword hand. "Courage, Vascour," he whispered in the other's ear. "I have a plan. Hold him but a moment longer and all will be well." But the balance of the sentence, with Astock, Prince of Dusar, he did not voice aloud. Vascour, dreaming no treachery, nodded his head and for a moment succeeded in holding Carthoris at bay. Then the Heliumite and the girl saw the Dusarian prince run swiftly to the opposite side of the chamber, touch something in the wall that sent a great panel swinging inward, and disappear into the black vault beyond. It was done so quickly that by no possibility could they have intercepted him. Carthoris, fearful lest Vascor may similarly elude him, or a stock return immediately with reinforcements, sprang viciously in upon his antagonist, and a moment later the headless body of the Ducerian noble rolled upon the Ursite floor. "Come," cried Carthoris. "There is no time to be lost. Astok will be back in a moment with enough warriors to overpower me." But Astok had no such plan in mind, for such a move would have meant the spreading of the fact among the palace gossips that the Tarthian princess was a prisoner in the East Tower. Quickly would the word have come to his father, and no amount of falsifying could have explained away the facts that the Jedek's investigation would have brought to light. Instead, Astok was racing madly through a long corridor to reach the door of the tower room before Carthoris and Thuvia left the apartment. He had seen the girl remove the key and place it in her pocket pouch, and he knew that a dagger point driven into the keyhole from the opposite side would imprison them in the secret chamber till 8 dead worlds circled a cold, dead sun. As fast as he could run, Astok entered the main corridor that led to the tower chamber. Would he reach the door in time? What if the heliumite should have already emerged and he should run upon him in the passageway? Astok felt a cold chill run up his spine. He had no stomach to face that uncanny blade. He was almost at the door. Around the next turn of the corridor it stood. No, they had not left the apartment. Evidently Vascor was still holding the heliumite. Astok could scarce repress a grin at the clever manner in which he had outwitted the noble and disposed of him at the same time. And then he rounded the turn and came face to face with an auburn-haired, white giant. The fellow did not wait to ask the reason for his coming. Instead he leaped upon him with a long sword, so that Astok had to parry a dozen vicious cuts before he could disengage himself and flee back down the runway. A moment later Carthoris and Thuvia entered the corridor from the secret chamber. "Well, Kamak," asked the heliumite. "It is fortunate that you left me here, Red Man," said the bowman. "I but just now intercepted one who seemed overanxious to reach this door. It was he whom they call Astok, Prince of Dusar." Carthoris smiled. "Where is he now?" he asked. "He'd escaped my blade and ran down this corridor," replied Kamak. "We must lose no time." "Then," exclaimed Carthoris, "he will have the guard upon us yet." Together the three hastened along the winding passages through which Carthoris and Kamak had tracked the Ducerians by the marks of the latter's sandals in the thin dust that overspread the floors of these seldom used passageways. They had come to the chamber at the entrances to the lifts before they met with opposition. Here they found a handful of guardsmen and an officer who, seeing that they were strangers, questioned their presence in the palace of Astok. Once more Carthoris and Kamak had recourse to their blades, and before they had won their way to one of the lifts the noise of the conflict must have aroused the entire palace, for they heard men shouting, and as they passed the many levels on their quick passage to the landing stage they saw armed men running here and there in search of the cause of the commotion. Beside the stage lay the Thuvia, with 3 warriors on guard. Again the heliumite and the Litharian fought shoulder to shoulder, but the battle was soon over, for the Prince of Helium alone would have been a match for any 3 that Dusar could produce. Scarce had the Thurier risen from the ways before 100 or more fighting men leaped to view upon the landing stage. At their head was a stock of Dusar, and as he saw the 2 he had thought so safely in his power slipping from his grasp, he danced with rage and chagrin, shaking his fists and hurling abuse and vile insults at them. With her bow inclined upward at a dizzy angle, the Thuria shot meteor-like into the sky. From a dozen points swift patrol boats darted after her, for the scene upon the landing stage above the palace of the Prince of Dusar had not gone unnoticed. A dozen times shots grazed the Thuria's side, and as Carthoris could not leave the control levers, Thuvia of Tarth turned the muzzles of the craft's rapid-fire guns upon the enemy as she clung to the steep and slippery surface of the deck. It was a noble race and a noble fight, one against a score now, for other Ducerian craft had joined in the pursuit, but Astok, Prince of Dusar had built well when he built the Thuvia. None in the navy of his sire possessed a swifter flyer, no other craft so well armored or so well armed. One by one the pursuers were distanced, and as the last of them fell out of range behind, Carthoris dropped the Thuvia's nose to a horizontal plane, as with lever drawn to the last notch, she tore through the thin air of dying Mars toward the east and Tarth. 13,500 hods away lay Tarth, a stiff 30-hour journey for the swiftest of flyers, and between Dusar and Tarth may lie half the navy of Dusar, for in this direction was the reported seat of the great naval battle that evening now may be in progress. Could Carthoris have known precisely where the great fleets of the contending nations lay, he would have hastened to them without delay, for in the return of Thuvia to her sire lay the greatest hope of peace. Half the distance they covered without sighting a single warship, and then Carcomac called Carthoris' attention to a distant craft that rested upon the ochre vegetation of the great Dead Sea bottom, above which the Thuvia was speeding. About the vessel many figures could be seen swarming. With the aid of powerful glasses, the Heliumite saw that they were green warriors, and that they were repeatedly charging down upon the crew of the stranded airship. The nationality of the latter he could not make out at so great a distance. It was not necessary to change the course of the Thuvia to permit of passing directly above the scene of battle, but Carthoris dropped his craft a few hundred feet, that he may have a better and closer view. If the ship was of a friendly power, he could do no less than stop and direct his guns upon her enemies, though with the precious freight he carried he scarcely felt justified in landing, for he could offer but 2 swords in reinforcement, scarce enough to warrant jeopardizing the safety of the Princess of Tarth. As they came close above the stricken ship, they could see that it would be but a question of minutes before the green horde would swarm across the armored bulwarks to glut the ferocity of their bloodlust upon the defenders. It would be futile to descend, said Carthoris to Thuvia. The craft may evening be of Dusar, she shows no insignia. All that we may do is fire upon the horde's men, and as he spoke he stepped to one of the guns, and deflected its muzzle toward the green warriors at the ship's side. At the first shot from the Thuvia those upon the vessel below evidently discovered her for the first time. Immediately a device fluttered from the bow of the warship on the ground. Thuvia of Tarth caught her breath quickly, glancing at Carthoris. The device was that of Kilentithe, Jeddak of Kaal, the man to whom the Princess of Tarth was betrothed. How easy for the Heliumite to pass on, leaving his rival to the fate that could not for long be averted. No man could accuse him of cowardice or treachery, for Kilentithe was in arms against Helium, and, further, upon the Thuvia were not enough swords to delay evening temporarily the outcome that already was a foregone conclusion in the minds of the watchers. What would Carthoris, Prince of Helium, do? Scarce had the device broken to the faint breeze before the bow of the Thuvia dropped at a sharp angle toward the ground. "Can you navigate her?" asked Carthoris of Thuvia. The girl nodded. "I am going to try to take the survivors aboard," he continued. "It will need both Carcomac and myself to man the guns while the Kaolians take to the boarding tackle. Keep her bow depressed against the rifle fire. She can bear it better in her forward armor, and at the same time the propellers will be protected." He hurried to the cabin as Thuvia took the control. A moment later the boarding tackle dropped from the keel of the Thuvia, and from a dozen points along either side stout, knotted leathern lines trailed downward. At the same time a signal broke from her bow. "Prepare to board us." A shout arose from the deck of the Kaolian warship. Carthoris, who by this time had returned from the cabin, smiled sadly. He was about to snatch from the jaws of death the man who stood between himself and the woman he loved. "Take the port bow gun, Carcomac," he called to the bowman, and himself stepped to the gun upon the starboard bow. They could now feel the sharp shock of the explosions of the green warriors' projectiles against the armored sides of the staunch Thuvia. It was a forlorn hope at best. At any moment the repulsive ray tanks may be pierced. The men upon the Kaolian ship were battling with renewed hope. In the bow stood Kilentithe, a brave figure fighting beside his brave warriors, beating back the ferocious green men. The Thuvia came low above the other craft. The Kaolians were forming under their officers in readiness to board, and then a sudden fierce fusillade from the rifles of the green warriors vomited their hail of death and destruction into the side of the brave flyer. Like a wounded bird, she dived suddenly marsward, careening drunkenly. Thuvia turned the bow upward in an effort to avert the imminent tragedy, but she succeeded only in lessening the shock of the flyer's impact as she struck the ground beside the Kaolian ship. When the green men saw only 2 warriors and a woman upon the deck of the Thuvia, a savage shout of triumph arose from their ranks, while an answering groan broke from the lips of the Kaolians. The former now turned their attention upon the new arrival, for they saw her defenders could soon be overcome and that from her deck they could command the deck of the better manned ship. As they charged, a shout of warning came from Killantythe upon the bridge of his own ship, and with it an appreciation of the valor of the act that had put the smaller vessel in these sore straits. "Who is it," he cried, "that offers his life in the service of Killantythe? Never was wrought a nobler deed of self-sacrifice upon Barsoom." The green horde was scrambling over the Thuria's side as there broke from the bow the device of Carthoris, Prince of Helium, in reply to the query of the Jeddak of Kaol. None upon the smaller flyer had opportunity to note the effect of this announcement upon the Kaolians, for their attention was claimed slowly now by that which was transpiring upon their own deck. Carcomac stood behind the gun he had been operating, staring with wide eyes at the onrushing hideous green warriors. Carthoris, seeing him thus, felt a pang of regret that, after all, this man that he had thought so valorous should prove, in the hour of need, as spineless as Jav or Tario. "Carcomac, the man!" he shouted. "Grip yourself. Remember the days of the glory of the seafarers of Lothar. Fight, fight, men, fight as never man fought before. All that remains to us is to die fighting." Carcomac turned toward the Heliumite, a grim smile upon his lips. "Why should we fight?" he asked. "Against such fearful odds. There is another way, a better way. Look." He pointed toward the companionway that led below deck. The green men, a handful of them, had already reached the Thuria's deck as Carthoris glanced in the direction the Lotharian had indicated. The sight that met his eyes set his heart to thumping in joy and relief. Thuvia of Tarth may yet be saved, for from below there poured a stream of giant bowmen, grim and terrible, not the bowmen of Tario or Jaff, but the bowmen of an odd war of bowmen, savage fighting men, eager for the fray. The green warriors paused in momentary surprise and consternation, but only for a moment. Then, with horrid war cries, they leaped forward to meet these strange, new foemen. A volley of arrows stopped them in their tracks. In a moment the only green warriors upon the deck of the Thuria were dead warriors, and the bowmen of Carcomac were leaping over the vessel's sides to charge the Hortus men upon the ground. Utan after Utan tumbled from the bowels of the Thuria to launch themselves upon the unfortunate green men. Killantythe and his Kaolians stood wide-eyed and speechless with amazement as they saw thousands of these strange, fierce warriors emerge from the companionway of the small craft that could not comfortably have accommodated more than 50. At last the green men could withstand the onslaught of overwhelming numbers no longer. Slowly, at first, they fell back across the ochre plain. The bowmen pursued them. Carcomac, standing upon the deck of the Thuria, trembled with excitement. At the top of his lungs he voiced the savage war cry of his forgotten day. He roared encouragement and commands at his battling Utans, and then, as they charged further and further from the Thuria, he could no longer withstand the lure of battle. Leaping over the ship's side to the ground, he joined the last of his bowmen as they raced off over the dead sea bottom in pursuit of the fleeing green horde. Beyond a low promontory of what once had been an island, the green men were disappearing toward the west. Close upon their heels raced the fleet bowmen of a bygone day, and forging steadily ahead among them Carthoris and Thuvia could see the mighty figure of Carcomac, brandishing aloft the turquoise-iron short-sword with which he was armed, as he urged his creatures after the retreating enemy. As the last of them disappeared behind the promontory, Carthoris turned toward Thuvia of Tarth. "They have taught me a lesson, these vanishing bowmen of Lothar," he said. "When they have served their purpose they remain not to embarrass their masters by their presence. Kilentith and his warriors are here to protect you. My acts have constituted the proof of my honesty of purpose. Goodbye, and he knelt at her feet, raising a bit of her harness to his lips. The girl reached out a hand and laid it upon the thick black hair of the head bent before her. Softly she asked, "Where are you going, Carthoris?" "With Carcomac, the bowman," he replied. "There will be fighting and forgetfulness." The girl put her hands before her eyes, as though to shut out some mighty temptation from her sight. "May my ancestors have mercy upon me," she cried, "if I say the thing I have no right to say. But I cannot see you cast your life away, Carthoris, Prince of Helium. Stay, my chieftain, stay, I love you." A cough behind them brought both about, and there they saw standing, not 2 paces from them, Kilentith, Jeddak of Kaol. For a long moment none spoke. Then Kilentith cleared his throat. "I could not help hearing all that passed," he said. "I am no fool, to be blind to the love that lies between you, nor am I blind to the lofty honor that has caused you, Carthoris, to risk your life and hers to save mine, though you thought that that very act would rob you of the chance to keep her for your own. Nor can I fail to appreciate the virtue that has kept your lips sealed against words of love for this Heliumite, Thuvia, for I know that I have but just heard the first declaration of your passion for him. I do not condemn you. Rather should I have condemned you had you entered a loveless marriage with me.